I was recently watching one of my favorite television shows where a separated couple decided to try and make their marriage work again. When their issues returned and the tension increased, the husband said he was afraid of what might happen if they started fighting again. Then the wife replied, "I'm afraid of what might happen if we don't." We can't escape conflict, but we can learn from experts like my guest today on why we handle conflict the way we do and how to navigate it successfully. Please welcome Dr. Linda Mintle.
Hi, Joy.
Hi, I'm
so good to be here. I like what the wife said.
I know,
Yeah,
and
we need to talk.
It was so incredible because the children could sense that there was tension
Always.
again, and so that's the father's concern. He was like, I don't want to fight in front of the kids, and so then it cuts to the next scene, and they're inside the car, and they're just hashing it out, but they're inside while the kids are, not watching them fight and feeling that tension, but they're like, we have to do this.
Right.
It's a really powerful moment. So,
well, it's really interesting. If you look at conflict, one of the biggest reasons that couples should consider, or anybody should consider in terms of dealing with conflict, is that we have studies that show that if you deal with conflict in your life, you actually live longer. So if you need a reason, that's a good reason to do it.
Well, and your book talks about, which this is the book we'll show, We Need to Talk. You talk about actually that there's research that shows that you can have physical repercussions if you don't. Like you might feel better in the moment if you're like, I'm not going to address this right now, but like the next day you actually can feel sick and ill,
right?
And it has negative repercussions.
And the reason that people take that sort of pause and they don't want to do it, because for all kinds of reasons why people avoid conflict, but at the moment that is a temporary stress reducer. So a lot of times we do what's immediate. We immediately want to get gratified, but you're right, it comes back with a vengeance the next day, and it does damage to many of the systems in the body, and that's one of the reasons why people don't live as long. It's because it is actually doing physical damage, and you're walking around with a lot of stress and anger and unforgiveness, which can do all kinds of things to the body.
And you have a whole chapter on forgiveness in here that's great. And I just want to be clear that this book isn't just about romantic relationships. Your relationships with your children, with your parents, with your friends.
With your boss.
Yes.
With your friends, with the people you go to church with your neighbors. All of these practical tips apply to everybody.
Yeah. And you say the presence of conflict does not need to make us cringe. You talk about, why is it that when someone sits down with us and says, we need to talk, that we my stomach flips. You talk about the spine, getting chills down the spine, but why is that?
Yeah, because most of us don't go, oh great, what is it that you want to say to me? This is going to be so exciting. No, it's just those words. It's like being in school. I wrote that book, and my boss actually did that to me the other day, and I had that same immediate reaction. I was like, what did I do wrong? Uh-oh, am I in trouble? What's going to happen? And that's usually our definition of what it means when somebody says that. We don't look at the positive side of it and say, okay, the idea here of dealing with conflict, it's in every relationship. It's completely normal. It's if you're a person who's with somebody else, you are not the same people, so everybody's going to have differences. And how we negotiate those differences is what really matters in all of this. But the reason that it creates that fear is because a lot of us haven't had good models for dealing with conflict. Like that couple you were talking about, maybe they haven't seen in their original families conflict dealt with very well. And so sometimes we're afraid. Sometimes we're insecure about who we are, or we're just determined we're going to be right in the situation, and we really don't want to resolve an issue. But we don't grow in our intimacy, and we don't get closer to people if we don't deal with conflict.
Is there a way that that physical manifestation can ever go away, or you just have steps in your book of how to process and get through it? Is that just a part of the life that we're going to...
Well, you might feel really tense when you're dealing with conflict, but that comes from not having a lot of experience doing it or not doing it well. So you think about a lot of people grew up with very difficult situations in their lives, and they didn't see conflict handled well. Maybe people were screaming, yelling. They see what we call a hostile style of conflict where it's scary. And so you might have that initial fear and that reaction of, I don't want to deal with this. But the more you practice dealing with conflict, the more you understand the steps that you take in dealing with conflict, and you get better at it. It's like any skill. The more you practice, the better you get at it. Then you can deal with conflict. You can have people say that, and you'll go, okay. Even at that moment when my boss said, I went, okay, wait a minute. Chances are there's something here that's going to be okay. We're going to deal with it. And even if there is a problem, I know how to deal with it, and I can handle it.
One of the great principles that you talk about is trying to take that take that moment to go, okay, we're going to hopefully come to some type of resolution, and approaching the person that you're in conflict with the mentality that maybe they have something to offer. Maybe there's some truth to what they're saying. We oftentimes go into conflict with so much, I've got to be right. Or on the defense because we assume they're going to tell us that we're wrong.
Right.
And so that just shifts things. You also told...
well, let me tell you two important things about that, what you just said. Two things are, the first thing is that you always want to make sure that conflict doesn't escalate.
Yeah.
So the dangerous part of conflict is if it goes from being mild to then having a huge escalation. Yes. That's what gets people in trouble. That's what ruins relationships and destroys things.
Yeah.
So trying to keep the conflict at a manageable level where it doesn't escalate into bad things. That's so important when we're talking about conflict. And I just want to make sure people understand that, because nobody wants to deal with a conflict if they think it's going to escalate into something very, very negative.
So the issue is not the problem, it's the escalation, which is oftentimes through the volume of our voice, our nonverbals that are negative, things like that.
And then the wanting to be right, which is such a part of this. So one of the steps...
I never want to be right.
Well, the problem with that is that when you're in that kind of a disagreement and you're always worried about, I'm going to get my point across, I'm going to make sure this person understands, and that is important that the other person understand, but the problem is it stops you from listening.
Yes.
And it stops you from taking the perspective of the person that you're having the conflict with.
Yeah.
And it also stops you then from listening to the part that maybe you're responsible for.
Yeah.
So one of the really important steps in this is you have to take responsibility for some part of the difficulty in a conflict.
Exactly.
Maybe you're being defensive, maybe you're not listening well, maybe you're blaming the other person, maybe you're not telling them the issue in a way that they can understand. But look at your part before you start looking at trying to be right.
Well, that changes your posture, right? If you go into something where maybe the other person's 90% wrong, you've been offended, you have to address this, but if you can go with that posture of maybe they have something valid, then you probably, even your nonverbals are probably more open to receive, and that person probably lowers their guard. But something I think that, so you've touched on that there's all these different conflict styles. I think I do hear most often people who are like, I just don't want to deal with conflict.
Right, it's the avoidant.
Yeah, and you told a story about Tim in here who didn't want to address something with one of his good friends. And you had a really important line that I think people who are of the personality type like Tim need to remember. You said, well, Tim, what's the alternative?
Right.
You know, to hold on to that, to not address these things, to let the friendship crumble. And I just think that, what's the alternative? People can remember.
And you don't get closer to people, and I think that's the ultimate goal. One of the reasons we're trying to deal with conflict is because we want deeper intimacy with that person. We want to know that person, we want to be known by that person.
Yeah.
And so if we don't push those issues and we don't try to deal with our disagreements, we're going to have a superficial relationship, and we don't want that in our lives. We want to be close to people and have that deep intimacy.
Well, because there's greater risk, right? If you actually take the time to tell someone where you feel like there's a conflict, then they actually know how they're offending you or hurting you, and then it could hurt that much more if they don't change.
And you have to take responsibility for what you've done and actually deal with your behavior, and a lot of times that means changing your behavior, which is a lot more difficult to do.
Yeah. Well, we're running out of time, but I really want to talk about, you sent me the quiz that you have that I think I tweeted it, you've tweeted it, people are going to want to take this. And it's to learn these different styles that you're talking about.
Your primary style.
And it literally takes like 90 seconds. I took it twice because I was taking it the first time and I was kind of putting myself up on a pedestal, and then I took it again and tried to actually...
You have to be honest.
I know. Because there's certain conflicts where I feel like I'm really mature, and there's other conflicts where I lose it. So here's my first result.
What was your primary style?
The first time I took it, 90% negotiator, 10% avoider.
Okay.
And then the second time I took it,
the honest time.
Yeah, 70% negotiator, 20% reactor, and still 10% avoider.
And I think if you take that at different times in your life, had I taken that when I was in my 20s and 30s, I probably would have been 80% reactor.
Yeah.
Because again, that was my family style. It's what I grew up with, it's what I bring to my relationships.
Yeah.
But the good news is you can work on your style, you can change your style. And the important point is that your style may not match the person you're in the conflict with. So you've got to make some adjustments, and I go into that in depth in the book. And if you're an avoider with someone who's a reactor, or if you're with a negotiator and the person wants to avoid,
Yeah.
how can you work together and how can you make those changes?
Yeah, it's a great tool to do with the person that you're in relationship. It's a great trigger to talking about these things when you're not in the middle of a conflict. So there's so much good stuff. I had so many notes I wanted to go through. The book is We Need to Talk, and you can get it from our e-store today. And be sure to visit drlindamintle.com to learn more about all the incredible ways she's serving people just like you and me.